I'm Jan Jacobi. I'm the author of Young Lincoln, and this is Author's Voice.
Welcome to Author's Voice, connecting authors to the world. You are watching our program, House Divided, and I am your host for the day, Bjorn Skaptason. Welcome to Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, where whence we stream these live events to you all over the world. We have a great show today, and I want to introduce you to our author right offhand. But first, let's take care of a little bit of housekeeping. First, our book, Young Lincoln by Jan Jacobi. Wonderful book. We're going to start talking about it here in a minute, but it's from Reedy Press. We want to thank Reedy Press for helping get Jan to us today. The cost is $16.95. And at any point during this program, you can order a signed copy of Young Lincoln. Jan will be happy to sign it for you, and we will ship it out to you wherever you are. Want to welcome Jan Jacobi to our show. Welcome, Jan.
Thank you, Bjorn.
Hey, I want to tell you about Jan, a little bit of biography. Jan Jacobi has taught middle school English and humanities for more than 40 years. Congratulations. For 27 of those years, he served as the head of lower school at St. Louis Country Day School and the head of middle school at MICDS. Jan is currently teaching humanities at St. Michael's School of Clayton, where he was recognized in 2014 as Middle School Teacher of the Year by St. Louis Magazine. Congratulations on that.
Thanks again, Bjorn.
And welcome to the show. And let's jump right on in. Tell us about, I'm going to tell everyone at home, Young Lincoln is a novel for young readers about young Lincoln. So tell us what inspired you to tackle Lincoln from this point of view.
Well, Bjorn, I am a teacher, first of all, and my students would ask me on a number of occasions for a recommendation on a book on Lincoln. And I would know that there were wonderful juvenile books about Lincoln and the adult biographies, but there was nothing for young adults. And so my students said, well, actually a colleague said to me, you ought to try and write it. So I did, and gave it to Reedy Press, and it was rejected. So then I rewrote it to specifications. It was rejected again, second time. And in the middle of all this, the publisher and my daughter, who was working for him, had lunch, and they said, he really ought to try it first person. And I thought, who on earth can do that? So, by the way, this book took 7 years to write, so that was the early process of it. But I did have an opportunity one summer to be in the Clayton Library in St. Louis, and I wrote about Lincoln in his years in Kentucky and Indiana. It's a shorter part of the book. Most of this book is about New Salem. New Salem is the part of Lincoln's life that I absolutely love. But since the first copy of it, first draft, had begun in New Salem, I hadn't done the Kentucky and Indiana years. And when I did that, somehow Lincoln's voice flowed.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, yeah, once you got it into the first person, what was it about Lincoln's childhood that inspired you to go after that? Was it because you were writing for the kids?
Well, there again, I'd have to say I give the publisher credit for that. But, you know, working with a publisher and an editor on this thing really made all the difference. Writers will have told, I've heard over the years, that when they do write, it's an editor that really pulls things together. So again, as I say, the first draft, first copy of the first idea of doing it started with New Salem. So they said, you know, for your readers, you really need to cover Kentucky and Indiana. I'm not personally as familiar with that, but I did the research and then was able to write those. Again, as I say, the reason that the book kind of clicked was that because I hadn't written about those two periods earlier, doing it in Lincoln's voice, the voice came alive for me.
Yeah, let's talk more about that voice, because that's a real strong aspect, I think, to this story. And when I'll admit, when you first open the book and you start reading, you're going, okay, Lincoln is talking right to me, and so this is going to be a journey in finding that voice and finding where he's coming from. So, what did you find was valuable in finding that voice? When is Lincoln talking to us? How old is he? How old are we? How did you arrive at those conclusions?
Well, again, the first go-round of this was I kind of thought that Lincoln would be maybe March of 1865, the war's winding down, second inaugural's been given, and I kind of think to myself, maybe one late afternoon at the White House, Noah Brooks, they sat by the fire, and Noah Brooks asked him, what was it like when you were growing up? And I thought, what would Lincoln say to that? How would Lincoln introduce the story of his life? So I have a very brief excerpt that I'll give you, and this is
Sure, please do.
This opens the book. I am an unlikely fellow. No one would have thought I'd end up president. I didn't think so myself. When my friends first approached me and said I should run, I said, just think of such a sucker as me as president. When Molly first came to Springfield to live with her sister Elizabeth, she told everyone she was going to marry a president. Of course, that was when Douglas was sweet on her, and she thought she'd catch him. She married me instead. She always called me Mr. Lincoln, but I'm sure she never thought she'd called me Mr. President. As a boy, I used to read the fables of Aesop. These tales really set how I thought about the world. They were simple stories, mostly about animals, but I learned to crack them open like a walnut to get what was inside. I learned that if a story was told right, it could make a point without trying. Years later, I realized there was one about me that everyone knows, the tortoise and the hare. There's more to it than people think. You have to look at it closely. Here was this ugly, old, plodding tortoise telling this show-off hare that he could beat him in a race. It was sort of like when I challenged Douglas to those debates in '58. Without saying it, people were always telling me I was that tortoise. One fellow told me I was so ugly I had no business running for the state legislature. I was called Two-Face so often that I replied, if I had another one, do you think I'd be wearing this face? But the tortoise just kept at it. I never thought of being president, and I still don't. Twice I lost when I ran for the Senate. It was getting so I was proudest of being elected captain of my company in the Black Hawk War. The most I'd say for myself is that I became an instrument of purpose. Whether I'd been that all my life, I can't say. I sure never saw myself that way, and neither did anyone else. Some of those people in Salem would have said, he just loafs around reading his books all day. Ain't no good a coming of him. All I knew was I didn't want to be a farmer.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, that certainly gives us that voice, that first-person voice that we're going to encounter throughout the book. Now, you've spent years and years teaching the children that you're writing for. Did you find that Lincoln's troubles were somehow similar, or challenges were somehow similar to the same of the ones that the kids you were teaching? I mean, he didn't have to worry so much about his Facebook feed and how many friends he had, but was there any similarities?
I do find that. The first thing is that we know at the age of 22, when he comes to New Salem, his life is a mess, really. He calls himself a piece of floating driftwood. He has encountered tension with his father. He has encountered loss in his life, which leads to sadness, which probably leads to the depression. He has religious doubts. He's awkward around girls. That sounds like a lot of teenage boys that I know.
So yeah, he does encounter some of the same problems, but also he encounters problems as a boy and as a young man that are totally without the realm of kids these days. We were discussing before the show started, Panthers. Panthers. We don't need to hear that whole part. It'll scare the kids at home. But the deep, dark woods, the mysticism, the scariness of living in the woods.
Right. And I think another thing that is really true of Lincoln, but this is something I'd like to see young people return to, is that Lincoln spent, Bjorn, much of that time alone. Now, he also does with Honey, his dog, who's on the cover. But I think Lincoln learns into young adult, the importance of being alone. This concerns me a bit because I think today's young person is almost afraid of being alone. Or if they have alone time, they fill it with the texting and these social media and things. But it's in the aloneness that Lincoln learns not to be lonely. I think I would see him as what develops is his understanding of solitude. And I think that as you see that applied more to the adult Lincoln, I think that is why he is able to deal with all the stress and burden of the Civil War. He has this, I brought a little thing here, which I don't know it's quite the time to do it, but Shelby, I should know this offhand, but Shelby Foote on Ken Burns' DVD has a wonderful quote about Lincoln, which applies to this.
Yeah, go ahead.
He could remove himself from himself as if he were looking at himself. A very strange, a very eerie thing. And this is Lincoln being able to, in this alone time, in this solitude, to have a place where he can go and kind of be alone in a really wonderful way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And he told many stories throughout his life about his childhood. It was being alone in the woods, but also being alone in that small house with all the people around. If he was listening to the older people sitting around the fire and talking, he'd go off to his corner and listen to him and then think about it, get into his head and deconstruct the discussions they're having.
That's the reflective side. The reflective side. And that, again, is something I try and encourage my students to do, is in our lingo, we call it metacognition. But that's really what he's doing. He's thinking about his experience and processing it, growing from it, learning from it, and he does that all his life.
Mm-hmm. Now, if there are signposts in this book, you may intend to do this, but sometimes it's just what the reader sees when they read it. When I read it, if there are signposts in this book, they tend to fall along the lines of episodes of intense heartbreak. So once after another, Lincoln, as a young child, encounters intense heartbreak. And some of the characters say back to him, life is hard for us. Lots of people die. Why are you responding this way? Even the characters don't get how he responds to Sarah's death, how the other episodes.
That's particularly with Anne Rutledge, because the person who does really counsel him that way is Bowling Green. And Bowling Green says to him, Abe, this can crush you, or you can simply move ahead. And the Anne Rutledge thing had to be, we know that there are two episodes in Lincoln's life where he is deeply depressed. And one is after the death of Anne Rutledge. The other is when he decides that he withdraws from the engagement with Mary Todd. Both those times, it's very deep. And I think what moves him through, at least the first time with Anne Rutledge, is that friendship. He stays with Bowling and Nancy Green. And one of the scenes that I love the most is when Bowling Green walks up to the attic where Lincoln's in the room and sits on the bed. We know with Bowling Green that he almost probably broke the bed.
Yeah.
But, and again, I think that's what I love about this book too, I put in here, is that it's those wonderful mentors in New Salem, Jack Kelso, Bowling Green, Mentor Graham, Robert Rutledge. They teach Lincoln so much as a young man.
You anticipated a question I was going to ask, but I'm going to float it anyway. Yeah. Where did Lincoln find these mentors outside of his family? And maybe since you've mentioned a few of them, this leads us to why was Lincoln unable to find this mentorship inside his family?
Well, I just be perfectly honest, that gets a little bit to his relationship with his father, which is a difficult one. I think the mentor in his family, interestingly enough, is Sarah Bush Johnston Lincoln. She is a remarkable person, and we know that Lincoln did not attend his own father's funeral. But we do know that before he went to Washington, he made a particular trip out to visit his stepmother. And it's at that meeting that she has a sense that she will never see him again. But it's very moving. He goes, and I think that shows that probably of all those people, and maybe there is this fellow Colonel Jones in Indiana. I think Jones's Stores, where a lot of political things get started. He talks about it, and then reading newspapers and stuff like that when he's about 17 or 18. But I think the role of Sarah, his stepmother, Sally, as I call her, is very deep.
Mm-hmm. And then once he gets to New Salem, where a lot of your story takes place, he finds these other characters. It's almost as if he's gotten to the land of Oz, where he lands in this strange place, but there are all of these amazing characters out in the middle of the wilderness. He meets Bowling Green, he meets the Clary Grove boys, he meets all of these people that mentor him and help him develop into the man he became.
Mentor Graham, who probably is more a teacher, and Mentor Graham, of course, starts him with grammar, although Lincoln learns it on his own. But Mentor Graham is very important for the geometry and trigonometry that he'll need to be the surveyor. Robert Rutledge, and there is a group of intelligentsia in New Salem. They have the Literary and Debating Society. And Lincoln is invited to give he's invited in there. For the initiation is to give a speech. And they're all waiting for it. They don't know what it'll be. At first, Jack Kelso thinks, this is going to be one of those joke-filled evenings, and which of course is not. But Lincoln gives a speech on improvements, local improvements to Sangamon River. But there's those mentors. There's a couple of doctors in that town. And Jack Kelso is a fascinating person because no one knows exactly what his background was, but he's the one who teaches Lincoln about Shakespeare and Robert Burns. When I wrote this book, I spent a lot of time in New Salem, and I would sit on the banks of the Sangamon River and kind of think, what was it like when Kelso and Lincoln were sitting here and Lincoln was listening to Kelso recite Burns and passages from Shakespeare. That's a part I like.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that brings up the topic of New Salem, and not the part it plays in this book, but the part it plays in our culture, in our society. New Salem is a place. It's a park where people go to visit, like Gettysburg is a place that people visit, or the battlefields, or the Lincoln home in Springfield. But there's something about New Salem, the New Salem State Park, that generations of people have gone to get, as children, to get introduced to Lincoln, that really grabs our imagination, grabs the imagination of young people. Did you get that when you were going to New Salem?
Absolutely, Bjorn. That, in fact, I really owe my interest in Lincoln, my love of the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, which I come to constantly for books on Lincoln. And it was actually when I led, or as a group of teachers, we took our 7th grade to New Salem. And I will say one thing is that the various historical sites now have done a beautiful job on these introductory films. They're short, they're beautifully produced, and that one in New Salem is haunting about what was it about New Salem that helped Lincoln to, at the age of 28, be able to then go to Springfield as a licensed lawyer and a elected member of the legislature. And those 6 years really are central to his development. I'm sure everybody who takes various pieces of Lincoln's life say this is a central piece, but New Salem is so important, and they've done a beautiful job with that reconstructed village.
Now, do you have any particular observations of, I was going to ask you, do you take the kids there? You answered you do. Do you have any particular observations how perhaps a 7th grader, how this environment, how this place, how this interpretation of history grabs?
Well,
it
does. And I think I really should give a tribute to the New Salem Lincoln League, because through that they have a number of Lincoln historical interpreters. They're men and women who, when you go to the cottages, the log houses, they're there and they're dressed in period piece. They speak, and so we would take our kids to the Rutledge Tavern, and people in the Rutledge Tavern would tell you about it. So that's a very important, and they've kept that tradition alive. 400,000 people a year go through New Salem.
Is that so?
That's right. There's a lot of books I might be able to sell.
You need to send some flyers down there. But I think one thing that you point out is that obviously in 2018, students spend a lot of time with their electronic media, but a place like New Salem or any one of the battlefields or historic parts need not see that as a threat to getting the attention of the kids. In fact, it can be, as you say, with the introductory films, it can be helpful.
Absolutely. And again, I think the stories, as a child, I think I teach history as if it were his story. It could be her story, obviously, too. But it's the stories that intrigue them initially. And again, if I go off on a tangent here, and Dan Weinberg did a lovely piece on the antiquarian convention. I saw you have it on the website. And Dan talks about we need to get young people reading. We need to get young people reading about Lincoln. And if they can, Lincoln seems to me someone who, if a 12 to 15-year-old really begins to discover, it's a fascinating story that they can find unfolding in many deep and different ways.
And a place like New Salem has some of the legends, some of the myths, and then a lot of the more sturdily founded history, and presumably students who are just entering the craft of history, you may be able to use this as a tool to say, okay, that's a great story. What questions do you ask about that story, and how do you approach that? Do you find it useful in that way?
Well, yes. When you take them up there, the first thing that happens when you get to New Salem, interestingly enough, is you've gone over prairie for about 2 hours to get there from St. Louis, and then you go down into this river valley, little Sangamon River, and you come up, and New Salem is this lovely little village on a hill. So, and I think kids, aesthetics matter to children. People don't think so, but they really do. And they get out of the bus and they find this, to me, kind of this lyrical place. And then they see this haunting film, and they go through the cottages, and then you have those period reenactors there. There's the blacksmith is hammering away, and the cooper is building the barrels, and they go see the mill. And ever so slightly, it begins to dawn on them that, there's a world beyond.
True. Well, in your book, let's get back to the book. One of the most important chapters or things that happens in the book, events in the book, of course, is how Lincoln gets to New Salem. And people, I think, at home know about the flatboat and all the rest. But the reason he's doing that, he's on the way to New Orleans. And I want to move on to that topic and see, okay, we've got young Lincoln. His world has expanded from Indiana to New Salem, and now he goes all the way to New Orleans. What does that do to him in your story and the way you see him?
Well, there are two trips to New Orleans. I used the first one from the Indiana years, and the second one is just before he goes up to New Salem. But the first one is the first time out. It's he and Alan Gentry are taking the cargo down to New Orleans. They sell the hogs and all the other farm products, and then they obviously sell the wood from the flatboat itself. Now, interestingly, on that trip down, Lincoln and Alan Gentry are attacked by, they are Negroes. And these are possibly runaway slaves, but they're kind of, it's an early evening, they're on the flatboat, and all of a sudden they hear some rustling, and Lincoln goes up to explore. And in fact, they have Negroes with clubs smashing them. And Lincoln, in fact, this is a story, is that what rescues them is Gentry says to Al, Lincoln, get the guns. And these guys hightail it. Mm-hmm. But if there hadn't been some quick thinking, that could have been a very serious thing. That's and so he gets down. Now, New Orleans itself is a huge kaleidoscope of all sorts of different cultures. Mm-hmm. Now, it's the second one down there, second trip, that I think that's the story where he sees the slave auction. Mm-hmm. But the first one is, I think, expanding his horizon while he's in Indiana.
But he's been exposed to slavery far before this, whether from a tiny childhood in Kentucky, and then but I think what I want to bring this to is, again, that relationship with his father. And I think in this book you paint it very well, that conflict starting to evolve into a conflict that does not get resolved between these two in their lives. And that is the conflict of, when will Abraham's work become Abraham's? Why is Thomas keeping him legally, as he sees it, as a slave? And you start to explore that conflict.
I think, Bjorn, that Thomas just doesn't understand him. Mm-hmm. He just doesn't understand him. And he doesn't understand why Lincoln wants to read, why he wants education. Sally does, I think, more than his own father. His father, now again, as we have talked before, there are a couple of slightly different interpretations of the relationship with the father. The Indiana historians are a little bit more kindly disposed towards Thomas Lincoln. My work, which comes out of Herndon's Informants, it's a pretty, it's a relationship of tension. Mm-hmm. Because I think Thomas just doesn't understand him, and Lincoln, and of course the issue is that in Indiana, Thomas can rent him out. He can have Lincoln do, not only does Lincoln have to do all the work on the farm, but he works for other men, and then Thomas gets some money from that. And in this book, one of the things that relationship bubbles up with is when he gets back from the first trip to New Orleans, Thomas says, "Where's the money?" Mm-hmm. And Lincoln says at some point, which the Indiana people feels a little strong, I've been a slave in the Free States.
Yeah, and he mentioned that a number of times. We've discussed that with Sidney Blumenthal when he came and talked about his book, the first book of his four, where he's dealing with Lincoln as a child learning politics. He sees, in Blumenthal's world, he sees that episode as being political. I was a slave in a free state. And therefore he starts to begin thinking in terms of some compassion with enslaved people.
The beauty of Lincoln is that, in fact, I go back really to a Gary Wills talk, which was about, for me, 10 years ago. Gary Wills said, when you're dealing with Lincoln, you have to realize that Lincoln is a genius. And for me, I asked Doug Wilson at some point, I said, where do you see his genius? And he said, an intellectual genius and a literary genius. Well, it's Blumenthal, Doris Kearns Goodwin that give him to us as a political genius. I actually believe that Lincoln, the educator Howard Gardner, who has 7, now we put it 8 intelligences, the 2 intelligences that Howard Gardner points out to us are, and this is for children, interpersonal intelligence, which is social skills, but intrapersonal That's your relationship with yourself. And that is where I think Lincoln is his deepest genius. He's just, so I love this idea that Blumenthal and Goodwin are they give us the political side, and he's a genius there, no doubt, no doubt.
Well, one thing that you've already brought up, okay, we're at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. Welcome. You see the books behind us, including the book that you can order, and Jan will sign it. But we also sell, of course, the antiquarian. This is where you can get that old stuff. You can get the out-of-print stuff, or the Lincoln signature, if you would like to buy one. Just give us a call. But I want to talk about one of the pieces of source material. It's not something that you use a lot. I mean, we've talked about this, but it's an important one for a collection, and that's the work of Lewis A. Warren, in this case, Lincoln's Parentage and Childhood. Now, this is something written in the 20s, and it's particularly valuable in looking at what people in the 20s wanted to know about Lincoln's childhood. The same questions we're asking now. Oh, kids in 2018. In 1920, teachers were going, how do we get to these kids? And one of the things that Warren does is he takes you in the book to all these places. He's got photographs of where Knob Creek falls into the Ohio River, and then a caption saying, this is the first place Lincoln ever saw slaves. Mm-hmm. And then there it is. The people at home can see it right now.
Oh, wow.
There's a picture of the first place Lincoln ever saw slaves. And then many other pictures of places that he saw, the land that Thomas farmed, and all of that. But then it also weaves in a sort of legendary aspect, the old Indiana Lincoln, which has much more to do with, frontier boy and hardy, and as you say, very kind to Thomas. And this does not necessarily jibe with what people actually wrote and remembered, the Herndon informants, about what people said about Lincoln. His childhood was not idyllic, interrupted just by a couple of deaths. It was real trouble with the parent, with this father figure.
And as you said earlier, Bjorn, too, and here it is, in Indiana, the loss of his mother, 8-9, the loss of the sister. Another story that is in Indiana, when the mother dies, now I think Dennis Hanks is there, but Thomas leaves about 9 months after the death of Nancy Hanks, Lincoln, and goes to Kentucky to reconnect with Sarah Bush Johnson Lincoln, becomes Lincoln, of course. And then Abraham and Sarah are left alone in that cabin for several months. And when Sally comes back, this is in the book, she looks at them and says, Tommy, if I'd known you left these children like this, I might not have been interested in you. And they're starving, they're dirty, and Dennis Hanks doesn't know what the heck to do with them. So that is not a very happy moment in his life. And then, of course, later on, at the end of the Indiana period, when Sarah dies in childbirth, having married, I think it's Aaron Grigsby. And of course, the Indiana thing too is that point at which the Chronicles of Reuben, but we won't try. Right, we won't worry the children with that.
Yes, but certainly without going too deep into it, Lincoln remembers that there are some serious episodes of terror, living alone in the dark in Indiana.
I got that out of Warren. There's a little cautionary tale in here that Lincoln told people, which was that the two children had been out in the picking berries in the woods, and they were not too far from their cabin, and all of a sudden a panther jumped on top of the little girl and tore her to pieces. Yeah. And this little boy took a tomahawk out of his hand and whacked the panther right in the middle of the skull, and then he fainted. And then he woke up with half his leg eaten. He's still alive. Mm-hmm. But Warren has a footnote that pointed me to that lovely scene that is in there. And Lincoln says at the end, I think they were trying to scare us from going too deep into the woods.
But it is a scary thing. It is a scary thing. Now, one last thing that I want to talk about with you on the book is that is this book cover design. There is so much in that book cover that's so, it's not just lovely, but there's so much that tells us about what we're going to be seeing. It's so idyllic, but at the same time, you know, there's Lincoln and there's honey. And so did they design this for you, first of all?
Bjorn, on this one, Reedy Press,
Yeah.
which is this press in St. Louis, specializes in St. Louis history, and they broadened the lens for me to do this. Their cover designer, they have an artist by the name of Ed Kaler in St. Louis. And Josh Stevens, the publisher, had the idea of the cover of wanting Lincoln from the back. And then Ed designed it. Here, we haven't even talked about the heron, which is in here. And then there is the other thing at the top is this shooting star. And I'm a star lover, and in 1833 there was this meteor storm from the Leonid showers that went out, and there was this storm of meteors. And that's 1833, and he sees that in Salem. But the heron, which Ed put beautifully in this thing here, is actually a character in the book too. Okay. So, but Reedy deserves all the credit. You know, the nice thing that you find about being a writer is that it's hard work getting your manuscript, but if it's accepted by the publisher, they do wonders with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, once they start working with you and
the editor,
you learn the team. Yeah,
that's it.
Now, one thing that we recently on our sister show, Lady Bird and Friends, where Betsy Bird, which you should be watching, should be following because it's an amazing show, where Betsy Bird, the rock star, international rock star of children's librarians, brings in a lot of great children's authors, and she recently featured a nonfiction book about Belva Lockwood, and you can order a signed copy from our website. But you know, Betsy and the author Kate Hannigan talked about this nonfiction picture book, and one of the things that Betsy and Kate talked about was it has to have footnotes. And it has to be right, and it has to be focused. It doesn't matter if it's a picture book for young kids, because young kids are going to ask, as they ought to, how do you know that? And now you've written a novel, but you've still pointed us, you've still answered that question for us. How do you know that? And I think that's great. You've added a little bit of a bibliography and some footnotes. Tell me where that comes from and how just adding those, I'm sure you did it as feeling a responsibility to do it, but what does it do for the kids, for the reader that you're intending it to?
Well, excellent. And I think I felt responsible to the reader in this book for the fact that there are a number of places where the words in this text are Lincoln's own words. And I felt the reader should know that. This is not me writing this, and those are footnoted there. And so with that in mind to begin with, then I spoke to Bob Bray, who I admire and love.
Terrific scholar.
Oh, and Bob said, you know, you could probably not do it, but you might think of citing those sources. So I did, and actually there's a little thing at the end that I wrote, which tells people and tells young people and anyone about this book, my debt that I have. Again, this is my little piece of Lincoln, but this whole bookstore is full of magnificent scholarship. And so this book owes a debt to that. And so I wrote, so without the love and support of my wife, Ginger, who is here for us today too, is that I wrote, I have been reading and writing about Lincoln for almost 30 years. I stand on the shoulders of giants. I am indebted to them all. If my poor power to add or detract contributes to a student's enjoyment and understanding of our greatest president, it comes not so much from me as it does from the many scholars and writers upon whom I have relied. So this book is a novel. The concept is a novel. that you are in. I have attempted to put it in Abraham Lincoln's head and have him think and tell a story. That is complete fiction. But I did try to make sure that I was as close to the historical record as I could be. You know, those people in New Salem know what they're doing. They're wonderful. They do, because at one point, Ginger and I were able to go to the annual meeting of the New Salem Lincoln League, and one fellow came up with a book and he said, "You got something wrong."
Of course he did. That's why we have erasers.
And so he said, "Onstadt, when Lincoln sends the boy up to get the auger, you have him sending him up to Onstadt at the far end of the village. He moved there later."
You're off by 50 feet. And they're going to let you know it.
They're going to let you know.
But Jan, if you produce a work of art that elicits that kind of criticism, you know you've done it, right? You know you've succeeded in getting the story out there and grabbing people.
Well, he then told me that he liked it and asked me to sign it. So
yeah.
I was pleased. But they know their Lincoln.
Right. And this is a terrific story of Lincoln. As you said many times, it's a novel, but this is a terrific story of Lincoln, and we're gonna be glad to feature it on our Abraham Lincoln Bookshop shelves. It's going to play a part in Lincoln literature for young people. Fill a hole there, and I congratulate you for doing that.
Well, Bjorn, let me say flat to you and to Dan and to all the people here, it is an enormous honor to have young Lincoln in the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. It's I sit here years later. It's hard, our lives go so quickly, but I can remember just nosing around the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop and just saying, I love this place.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much, and I hope some of you folks at home come on in someday so that you can love it as much as Jan does. We try our best. This is a place where we want to share Lincoln with the world, which we can also do on Author's Voice, the program you are watching. And if you'll forgive me, we need to get on out of this program. You have been watching House Divided on Author's Voice. Jan Jacobi is our author. Young Lincoln is our book. Young Lincoln comes to us from Reedy Press, and we thank them. We send our thanks to Reedy Press for helping get Jan to us and helping getting this wonderful book to us. The cost of the book is $16.95. You can order it after the event. If you're watching this event on our YouTube channel afterwards, and you think, oh, there's no more signed copies. No, there will be. We're going to keep some here. So order it. Jan will sign it, and we'll ship it out to you. Now coming up on Author's Voice, I have a long list of brilliant shows that I totally have not lost. I'm going to telling my producer that I have not lost the list of upcoming shows. Here it is. The next show on Author's Voice coming up on March 15th. I think that's a Thursday, March 15th, next week. On Stranger Than Fiction, our general nonfiction show, at 3:30, Max Boot will be joining us. And everybody who has announced this, whether every author, every host that has announced this books, has said Max Boot the same way, just like I did. But Max Boot will be here with his new book, The Road Not Taken. Solved, our mystery show, will return on March 16th with a special episode of Solved where we are featuring best-selling author Jeffrey Deaver. Jeffrey Deaver actually going to be here on the same show that Jan Jacobi was on. His new book, The Burial Hour, that is March 16th at 3 p.m. And then finally on March 20th, Berta's Books, Roberta Rubin will interview author Kathleen Rooney about her new novel, Lillian Boxfish Takes a Walk. Again, that'll be March 20th at 3 p.m. If you have any questions, if you want to ask any questions, or if you want to get a signed copy, you can do that by visiting authorsvoice.net, our website. Again, if you're watching this on YouTube after the event on the YouTube channel, you could still get a signed book. There'll be a click through right there on the video, and you can order a signed book. Thank you for joining us on Author's Voice. Thank you,
Thank you,
Jan,
Bjorn.
for making the trip from St.
please.
Louis. And we will see you next time.